There I am. Before we begin, I'm going to tell you a little bit about me. I am the Director of Education and Educational Outreach at Maine's First Ship. I've been here since March of 2024. I know a lot of you think it feels like it's been a lot longer than that. But I really enjoyed my time here. I started here as just the education manager, and last summer when Kirsty stepped down, I stepped into the position of the Director of Education. My background is, I actually don't have a history background, even though I absolutely love history. My background is I studied English literature at University of Southern Maine, and I focused on medieval literature because growing up I always loved the King Arthur's tales, the Knights of the Round Table, those stories. This literature, English literature specifically, and history go very much hand in hand. To understand why they're writing the stories and how they write them, you need to have a better understanding of the societies that are writing them and the people that are writing them. So you learn a lot about the history as you're studying the literature. And I fell in love with the history part of it. I probably should have changed my major, but I was already 3 years into it and said I'm just going to graduate from then. So since then, I've become a certified interpretive guide and heritage interpreter. And I've been doing talks about history talks since 2016 as part of a different educational organization that I founded and run called History Live Northeast, which it goes to schools to talk about history and interactive and engaging with students ranging all the way from kindergarten up till high school. So deep down, though, I am a medievalist, and that's me in my medieval gear. So you have to bear with me for a minute. I'm a little nervous because usually I'm giving this talk in a talk like this in front of a bunch of middle schoolers. And I'm doing it in full medieval garb, as you can see. So to make myself feel a little more comfortable, if you don't mind, I'm just gonna put on my hat and I'll be ready to go. All right, there. I think that's much better. I feel much better. I love medieval history. I've been studying medieval history for close to 20 years. I've been a reenactor and interpreter for almost 30 years. And although a lot of people say I don't look old enough to have done anything that long, I've been doing it for quite a long time. So normally I focus on the late 100 Years' War, the Lancastrian era of the 100 Years' War. So that's Henry the 6th, 5th, and 7th, and specifically on Henry the 5th. And I talk mostly about the 1415 French campaign, which culminated and climaxed at the Battle of Agincourt, that I'm sure a lot of people have heard about. And I sort of need to talk here, because I sort of did a little bait and switch on you tonight. The original slide said, the King's ships, Henry V and the birth of the English Navy, when really it should read more like this, Henry V and the birth of the English Navy? So we're going to talk about a little bit of some contradictions here. Did Henry V found the Royal Navy? And the short answer is no. No, he did not. There had been a Royal Navy before. There had been a King's Navy, not even so much a Royal Navy before this, but he was not the father of it. So who did found the Royal Navy? Well, Henry VIII. Henry VIII did create the official Royal Navy in 1546. He significantly expanded the English Navy, and he made reforms establishing the permanent force, which still exists to this day. So he is called the father of the Royal Navy. His navy is what still exists in England today. But did he really create the British Navy, the English Navy? Really, it was this guy. It was John. A lot of people know John from the Robin Hood tales, the bad King John, the brother of Richard the Lionheart. Nobody liked him. The man who forced the barons to sign the Magna Carta, or the barons forced him to sign the Magna Carta, which is basically a blueprint for what our Constitution is today. He can really be the first one to say that he established the Royal Navy. He made Portsmouth its official home of the Royal Navy, the biggest port. He built up the fleet from a coastal defense force, and he actually had quite a large fleet at its height. he had at its height about 110 ships total. They were very small ships, though. Mostly they were barges and ballingers, as they were called, which we'll go into a little bit later. And they were primarily used for transporting troops to and from. And he created the 4 admiralties of the English Navy from what was known as the Cinque Ports. The Cinque Ports, meaning the 5 ports, were 5 coastal towns in England that basically had pledged to the king to have ships ready for coastal defense. And he created the admiralties out of these 5 ports. So why should we talk about Henry V? Well, there's a lot of reasons why we should talk about Henry V, and I'm a fan of every single one of them. But when it pertains to the navies, he really built upon John's model, focusing on the expanding of the fleet, of building it up quick. He focused on making sure there were more ports that were able to build these ships for him. He made movements towards a permanent naval force. Didn't really work out for him, and we'll go into the reasons for that in a little bit, but he did make those steps towards it. He established the first dedicated royal shipyards. So there were these ports that were out there that were saying that they'd supply ships ready for the coastal defense. He really established these dedicated ports building the royal ships, not just any ships, but the royal ships. He built ships for offense, just not defense. He had very specific goals for building an offensive fleet and not just a coastal defensive fleet. He streamlined a lot of the administration, and he used his navy as a statement to his foes. And this was using things as a statement was really a key thing that the late medieval royals and monarchy and the upper class did. They used things as statements, showing off their wealth and power. But why? Why did Henry focus on these things? Well, to understand that, you have to understand a little bit about Henry V. On your left, on my right there, that is Sir Laurence Olivier in his classic film Henry V, which was a brilliant propaganda piece and is one of my favorite films ever. A lot of the reasons why, for some reason, the armor in that film and the material culture in that film is far better than any modern day medieval culture film puts out there. So they really did their research on that. And then on the left there is probably one of the very few contemporary depictions of a young Henry. So basically the state about this is everything you know from Shakespeare is wrong. We know the story of Henry V from Shakespeare, party boy prince who, heavy is the man who wears the crown, suddenly sobered up as soon as he got the crown and was passed on to him, and he was suddenly in charge of England, and he became very devout and had to control France. That's not like what Henry was like at all. Henry never had a chance to be a party boy. He, from the age of 13, he was leading troops in Wales, trying to put down the Welsh uprising against his father and the English. He had been training for his role to be king almost since the day he was born. He was always, contemporary reports always say he was a very serious child. He was very devout, even as it wasn't just something that snapped and happened. As he became older, he started to use a lot of symbolisms to show how devout he really was. At the age of 20, he was the member of the Privy Council. So he was one of the people in charge and guiding his father to be in charge of the King of England. He took command of the government in 1410 when his father was very ill. Henry IV had a lot of illnesses that kept him from being able to do his duties. So his son stepped in for a period of time, which his father really did not like. So he started to make a lot of changes that his father didn't like, and he had to be put in his place at a point in time. Then in 1413, he was crowned king at the age of 26, and he did not inherit a stable kingdom. Henry IV was plagued with sickness. He was plagued with conspiracies. he was plagued with the French buying people off to try to put him down, and everybody thought that Richard still should have been king because Henry IV was a usurper. He took the crown from his cousin and thought that he had a better stand towards it. So very unstable times for him. And Henry V himself had to fight a lot of those conspiracies, even up to the night before he left for Agincourt. There was a conspiracy to kill him and replace him with a doppelganger of Richard II because everybody thought he was still alive, which led Henry to a later date actually having Richard II exhumed nicely. He put him in a very nice tomb, saying that he deserved a royal burial, but really it was a way for him to say, he's dead. He's really dead. So, all of this is taken in the background of the 100 Years' War. This is a long, outstanding conflict between England and France. Basically, this is one of the longest lasting family feuds in history. It was two branches of the same family, both saying that they had the right to rule France. One of them was saying they had the right to rule France and England. One of them just wanted France. So started by Edward III in 1337 because the King of France had died. He did not have a direct heir. It went to one, Edward III said that he had a direct line through his mother, who was the oldest daughter of the king and direct descendant of Charles I. Unfortunately, in France at the time, they had something that was called Salic law. And Salic law means that royal bloodlines can't be passed through the mother's line. It has to come from the father. And Edward III said, I don't believe that's true. I have a better stand for this. And he decided to invade France. And throughout history, things sort of ebbed and flowed. So at the beginning of it, you can see in 1337, England basically, it looks sort of white, it all looks the same color here, but that Bordeaux-Gascony territory, that's basically what England controlled. By 1360, they had really taken over a big chunk of France. They've gone into Aquitaine, they've taken over Brittany, and they had a firm hold on Calais. And they would keep Calais up until the mid-1500s. So when Henry inherited the throne in 1413 and started his plans to invade France starting in 1415, this is how much it had shrunk. Richard and Henry IV really couldn't focus on France. Richard wanted peace. He didn't want to go to war with France at all. He was willing to pay homage to the King of France. He was willing to give back almost all of the territories. And Henry IV said, had a group behind him that said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to kick Richard off the throne. And he came back. This is a lot more complicated than I'm going into, but I'm trying to get to the boat stuff, because this is a talk about the ships. So what was the makeup of the English Navy prior to 1413? Because Richard and Henry weren't investing in these wars, they were focusing more on defense in the Channel, and they had sort of outsourced it. So Richard had definitely outsourced a lot of it. He was leaving it up to privateers. Depending on what side you're on, you would call them pirates. Some of the people on the same side probably would have called them pirates too, because they were really prone to attacking their own ships. They didn't care whose side you were on. They just wanted your stuff, and they wanted to make money off of it. And two of the most sort of notorious pirates of this time, privateers of this time, were John Hawley the Elder and the Younger. Both of them were one-time mayors of Dartmouth, and they had made their riches in both trade and piracy. So they would go and they would rob ships, and then they would take everything off of those ships and sell them someplace else to make the money off of it. So it really cuts out, it's an extra step, but it really helps increase your overall profit margin. John Hawley the Younger also had a very tenuous relationship with Henry V. He at one point served on a number of his ships, and it was sort of on again, off again. He would do something Henry didn't like, so he would fire him, but then he would get back in his graces, and it would go back and forth like this for a few years. Transport ships were mostly hired. They were spending a lot of money on hiring merchant vessels. They were hiring vessels from the continent, from the Low Countries and Flanders, and paying a lot of money for these ships to transport troops over from England across the Channel into France for these chevauchés, as they say, these burnt ground expeditions that they would lead as they went through France. So what did Henry do? Henry came in, and even as early as 1410 when he was in charge, he started making big changes. One of the big things he did was he altered the admiralty and the administration of it all. He abolished the offices of the Admiral of the North and Admiral of the West. So at this time, there were 4 admiralties in England: the North, the South, the East, and the West. And he said, well, the North and the West are basically doing the same things. So he abolished them, and he combined them into one centralized administration office called the Admiralty Office, which was still in place up to the point when Henry VIII took over and created the Royal Navy. And it's still actually sort of the same office. He just renamed it to the Admiralty and Marine Office, and that lasted until 1707. And I don't know what it became after 1707. I didn't go digging that far. I think it might, again, be back to like the Admiralty Office. So this was a big change because suddenly people who were in high-powered positions are out, and it was replaced by one person. He really started standardizing payments to captains, crew, and owners, and established a dedicated English fleet to patrol the Channel. So by dedicated, I mean he had a fleet of ships that were specifically for patrolling the Channel. He also had other hired ships that came in that, while they were doing official royal business, they got a certain set upon price, the same as the other royal ships. And it was, sailors were getting 3 marks per day, masters were getting 6 marks per day. This wasn't bad. So, he started rapidly growing the number of ships. Between the rule of Richard II and Henry IV, the royal fleet had dropped to only 2 ships. Henry, realizing he was going to become king and wanting to take over when he did, when he took over in 1410, he actually put into motion to start increasing the Navy. So as early as 1410, even before he was king, he was having people building ships for him. So when he assumed the crown in 1413, it had increased from 2 to 7 ships. By 1415, 2 years later, he had increased it to 15 ships. And by 1418, he had increased it to 34 ships. And if you're counting all the little ships on this graph up here, you're only going to see 27 ships, because this graph is actually from 1420, and he had lost a couple of ships. So, and he started really increasing the size of the ships. And there's good reason for him doing that as well. He increased the production of them, as we just talked about. This is a rendering of what Southampton looked like in around 1417. So he really built up this town. And this actually came from a mutual beneficial arrangement. The mayors of Southampton had been sacked by the French a number of times before and basically almost leveled. And they were desperate to have some, capital invested in their towns to try to build it up. So they went to the king talking about this, and he was like, I've got an idea. Here's what we're going to do. So he started creating these dedicated royal fleet ports to build the ships, these shipbuilding ports. He increased the defenses of these places by building bulwarks and walls. He increased the number of artificial, you can see in this image here, down in the lower left-hand corner, that sort of dock that comes out. he was building out into the land. And if you look at modern day Southampton, they've built out even more from those docks. So it's almost like Portland, Maine. If you look at Portland, Maine, up until the 80s, they were filling in the back bay with land to increase the land mass of Portland. So he was doing basically the same thing in Southampton here. So we established Southampton. I really love that at Southampton there's an IKEA now. I think it just fits. I'm sure if they'd been building ships with IKEA, things would have gone a lot worse for him. And he started investing in a small town called Bursleden up the Hamble River there. And you can see from the image, when looking at Southampton, how they've built out from that original, that quay out there into the river. So he picked these two places for some really good reasons. One, they desperately wanted to do it, so he didn't have to fight anybody for it. Two, they were protected by the Isle of Wight. So they could set up places along the Isle of Wight and up inside the river to help protect them from fleets coming in. And it gave them good places to build up these defenses. And you can see Portsmouth's right there too, so it's not that far away from Portsmouth either. The other reason is it gave him almost a direct shot to exactly where he wanted to go in 1415. He could leave Southampton, where he was having everyone muster, and get directly down to, it's not marked on this map, but to a town called Harfleur. And that's where he set sail to in 1415 and laid siege to, and eventually kicked off his campaign across France. So it was highly convenient for him. So how did he increase this fleet so fast, other than just hiring a lot of people to build it? Well, there's other ways to do it. One, he hired ships. For the 1415 crossing, he did hire ships. He had close to 1,200 ships. Only about 100 of them were English at that time. Most of them were merchant ships. It was the largest European fleet assembled for that time. We know in some records he brought in at least 600 ships from Flanders in the Low Country, and he spent an equivalent of today's about $3 million of today's money to do that. So a lot of money to hire these ships. He also had to hire ships from English merchants, other allies. The English merchant ships, they didn't like it because basically he went and took them over. He did pay them, but they weren't making as much money as they would have made selling their wares. So that didn't make them happy at this time. Taking the ships that were, there's a typo in there, I'm sorry. Ships won in battle were taken to be used. Ships were confiscated from merchants and pirates. And while he did pay for the ships, he also paid far less than the value of the cargo. And he converted ships. Merchant ships that he bought or took, he converted them into warships. Ships that were taken in battle were repaired, refitted, and renamed. And he also built a bunch of new ships. So what types of ships were there? While there were a few outliers, primarily the English fleet at this time were made up of these three specific types of ships. You have the Ballingers, a type of sailing barge, also had oars. This was basically a European take on the galley. So it was less than 100 tons, usually could carry between 40 and 50 people, and crew on top of that, crewed by a minimal amount of people. They were used for cargo, horses, and troops. They could get into very shallow waters. They could bring them right up the coast, and they're fast and easy to sail. And here's a larger picture of that ship. You can see very shallow, very wide, usually had a mast, one mast, only if they never had more than one mast, and they had oars. They had cogs. Cogs made up the majority of ships in England at this time. So these were primarily merchant ships. They were one or two masts, depending on the size. They were retrofitted with castles for archers and troops. and we'll talk about the castles in a little bit more in a minute. They were usually between 25 and 100 tons. The largest, oh God, I really rushed through this one. Largest going to 200, a rare few over 500 tons. Carrack, I'm sorry, let me go to the picture. There's a couple of cogs here. There's a modern artist rendition of a cog. There is a reproduction cog in Belgium. And then there's an artist rendition of a cog in a medieval manuscript of dating of around the 1400s. And then there were the carracks. These are the largest of the types of ships. They had 3 to 4 masts depending on size. The largest were over 2,000 tons. And then there's 2 renditions of the carracks. These look more like what we might consider a ship to look like once we get into the 17th century, especially the 16th, 17th century galleons and things like that. These were basically the proto-galleons. These are what started. There's a couple of very famous carracks. The Santa Maria was a carrack. And this next one's going to be very controversial. The Mayflower may have been a carrack. So depending on what sources you read, the Mayflower is described as a carrack. It is described as a flute, which is a Danish type of ship, or a Belgian, or it is also called, this is the Mayflower II, which is out of Plymouth. And if you ask the crew, which I did, the crew will tell you that she is not a carrack or a flute. She is a, bark-rigged, race-built galleon. I'm not quite sure what that means, but they were very adamant about those terms. Still very similar. What I could tell about the galleons and the flutes and the carracks, the basic difference is the carracks usually had the more decks inside them than the early galleons or the flutes. So you can see there's a pinnace alongside her. They had 2 types of styles of building ships for this time. And I see Rob's back there is paying great attention to this now because I actually asked him this question about our ship a couple of weeks ago, and I've stumped him, so he was going to find out from me, or maybe he's forgotten about it. But 2 different styles of building. Clinker built. This was the predominant style of ships built in England at this time. That is the overlapping sort of lap strike, it's also called. And then the Carvel built, and that's where they butt up against each other. One more detail, the Carvel built. Virginia out there is a Carvel built ship. So she has the planks that butt up against each other with the caulking stuffed in between in the planks. And they are fastened directly to a frame. So they're heavier because they have a more robust frame. On a Carvel built ship, you build the frame first, and then you put the planks along it. As a more rigid hull that can withstand greater sail configurations, requires more caulking material, requires greater expertness, oh God, I really messed this up. Expertise to build, never rely on spell check, folks, for God's sakes. More expensive and time consuming, and harder to quick repair. If you all can't tell, I finished this today. The clinker built. They had a lighter, more flexible frame. And that was because on a clinker built, you put the planks together first, and then you build the frame inside of it, which seems like a reverse way to build a ship for me, but that's what they did. And a less rigid hull because of that, though. So it usually could only take no more than 2 masts, or it would start to put too much pressure on the hull, and they'd twist and snap and sink, and you don't want that. They do require less caulking material. Because the boards overlap, what they would do is when they overlap the boards, they would put moss and tar in between the boards, and then they would cinch them together so it closed up more. So it took less caulking material to put together. They were cheaper and faster to build because you needed less material. Easier to repair quickly. So on a clinker built, if one of those planks rots out, you just tank that that plank out and you slide a new plank up underneath it, you don't have to go through and replace and overlap and recaulk and do all that stuff. And it takes less expertise to put together. Talked about these being retrofitted with castles. This is what I mean by castles. Those red circles at the you have a forecastle, you have an aft castle, and then you have a castle up on the mast. These were put in specifically for archers. So they could sit in those, they could be above the other ships, and they could fire arrows into them. Because, as you can see in the artwork, these are contemporary French and English artwork from around 1350 up until 1420. You can see that each of these is depictions of the castles on them. I also love that bottom picture because if you look really closely, there's an elephant in that boat behind them. That's what I love about medieval manuscripts is you always have to double check what you're looking at because you never know exactly what they're trying to depict. I had to do some research here, so that's from the Morgan. I forget the long name, but basically it's the history of the world before Caesar. So what that's depicting is Hannibal sacking Rome. So he didn't ride the elephants over, he brought them in a boat. A lot of times what you see in medieval manuscripts is artists who don't fully understand what they're trying to depict, or artists trying to depict things that they think their contemporary audience will understand better. So you get some weird things sometimes. Like, I don't really think any of the boats were that small, where 6 guys were just standing up in them and you could see they're gonna fall over. It's just to show off the people. Okay, why did they have these castles on them? Why didn't they just fire the cannons? Well, here's the reason why. Naval warfare during this time was basically land warfare on boats. So what they would do is they would pull up to another boat, use grappling hooks, lash the decks together, and then fight over the sides of them like they would fight on land. So a lot of spear work, a lot of sword work, pole arms. I love the picture, this picture up here. That's depicting the Battle of Sluys, which was a decisive English victory in the 100 Years' War. From about 80 years after the event, though, maybe even a little more, because this is from Chronicles of Froissart. And personally, my little soapbox tangent here, I can't stand Froissart because I think that he didn't actually know what he was talking about a lot of times. And he relied on secondhand accounts, and he depicts everything in a futuristic setting with elements that are there to sort of resemble what it could have looked like back then. But I do like this picture as being a great depiction of what a naval battle probably really looked like. You have archers in the forecastle, you have them up on the mast, either shooting down or you have them dropping things down. And then probably the best way to win a battle, as you see there, you just start throwing people off the side. They're wearing armor, they can't swim. So now we're going to get to talk about Henry's 4 great ships. These were sort of his crowning achievements, and these were the true royal ships. And we're going to go into the detail on these in sort of, not so much chronological order, but in order of the ones we know the most about. Because there are a few of these ships that we don't really know that much about. And you're going to notice a theme with the names, I think, from the second one. The Jesus of the Tower. All of these ships have the name of the Tower after them. This was basically the precursor of HMS. This is showing these belong to the king. They're the Tower of London is what it's depicting. It's talking about the seat of power. So any ship of that time that had of the Tower after it was a king's ship. So the Jesus of the Tower. The image you're showing, we don't actually know if that was the Jesus. We don't know if there's any depiction of this ship at all. This is from a manuscript depicting his fleet. We just don't know if that's it or not. It was a 2-masted, 1,000-ton clinker carrack. So the overlapping, the clinker style, it was that carrack type of ship, and had 2 masts. It was built between 1414 and 1416 in a town called Smallheath. Most likely took part in the Battle of Chef de Coq in the 1417, which is the naval battle of Harfleur, often called the Siege of Harfleur. Basically in 1415, Henry had taken over the town of Harfleur, hard fought, won it. And 2 years later, the French put together a navy trying to take it back. And this was one of the first real tests of the newly formed Henry's Royal Navy, was he took them out there and he laid waste to the French ships. It was almost a total victory for the English. The Jesus was the first 1,000-pound carrack built in England, possibly even in Europe for the time. So this was, for its time, the largest ship ever built. Had 7 anchors, the heaviest weighing 2,500 pounds. It was big. Crewed by 200 and carried up to another 200 men-at-arms and archers. And at the end of its life, it docked on the River Hamble between 1432 and 1433, which is its final resting place. The Holy Ghost of the Tower. The theme, you figured out the theme. Slightly bigger. This was, she was around 760 tons. She was while Jesus was specifically built, stick built from the ground up, Holy Ghost was a rebuilt Spanish merchant ship called the Santa Clara. I'm going to clean up these slides before you, you post them someplace. Called the Santa Clara, renamed as the Holy Ghost. She was part of the 1415 fleet to Harfleur. She was the flagship of the king's brother, the Duke of Bedford. Took part in the Battle of Chef de Coq in 1417. She had 7 cannons on her, 7 guns. She had the most of any ship in the fleet. Of all 34 ships, only 15 of the ships Henry had cannons on them. And almost half of them, were on this ship. He didn't have a lot of cannons. Cannons were expensive. They were hard to use. They could blow up your ship just as easily as blow up the other guy's ship. And keeping gunpowder dry at this time was really difficult. But she had 7. And we know that she used at least 2 of them in the battle, the naval battle of Harfleur in 1417. Again, she was crewed by around 200 and carried up to another 200 men-at-arms and archers. And she is also at the docked on the Hamble River in 1420s, where she came to an end. And then we have some renditions. So this is a ship that they think was the Holy Ghost. Again, this image is about 50 years later than what time it would have been, later than 1420. So it's into the 1500s by this time. And here's an artist's rendition of what she may have looked like based on some other descriptions. The Trinity Royal of the Tower. So this was actually the first of Henry's great ships. And it was an English merchant ship called the Trinity. It was also the smallest of his great ships, coming in only about 540 tons. This was his flagship in the 1415 transit to Harfleur. Or I say invasion, because it was an invasion. So we know, the most we know about this ship is how she was decorated for this transit. She had a gilded crown on the forecastle, a gilded crown on a leopard somewhere on the ship. We don't know where, they never got into detail. But somewhere on the ship was a statue of a leopard with a gilded crown. The capstan, which is used for raising and lowering the anchor, so a tool of the ship. The bar of the capstan was a gilt copper scepter with 3 gilt fleur-de-lis on it. She had 18 flags on her. All of them had different religious slogans on them. The flags also had Henry's arms on them and the arms of France. When I said that Henry was started using the Navy as a statement, this is what I mean. He had this ship decked out to say, I'm the king. I'm not only the king of England, I'm the king of England and France. And I'm coming over to get what belongs to me. So this ship went out in front of a fleet of 1,200 ships, decked to the nines, and made it over there. Could you imagine in modern warfare, someone going out, a leader of a country going out with flags waving, hey, here I am, look at me? That probably wouldn't end well, would it? She possibly had 5 guns on her. We don't really know. We don't have any record of them being used. She met her end, and after a long service was docked in the River Handle in 1429. This is a 19th century engraving of her, and for as much as I hate the Victorians even more than I hate the Froissart, but again, there's no images of this ship contemporary for some reason. You'd think if you went to that much trouble to decorate it the way he did, you'd have some artwork of it somewhere. Now we're going to get to the big one, literally the big one. The Grace Deo of the tower. Now you have to please excuse me, being raised in Maine for the majority of my life, I look at this and I say, Grace Deo. So, just something I do. I've had to train myself to not do it. How the rest of the school? Well, it should be Grace Deo, but I said, I'm going to overthink it now. To what was seen of this ship, it says, I've never seen so large and beautiful a construction. This was a quote in his diary by a man named Luca di Massa degli Albizzi, captain of the Florentine galleys in 1430. He came aboard the Grace Deo in 1430 to have dinner with a man named William Soper, who was the head of the Southampton shipyards at that time. So this was the last of Henry's great ships. She was launched in 1418 from Southampton. She was somewhere between 1,400 and 2,500 tons. So this was the largest ship in Europe and probably the world of this time. No ship had been built as large as this up until then. She was a triple plank clinker design. 170 feet long, 49 feet wide. Her forecastle was 50 feet above the water, and her main mast was somewhere between 190 and 200 feet. You're going to see that it says she was between and probably and things like that. We don't actually know how big she was, because after she was docked, and there was no real record kept of how big she was, they started selling off pieces of her. So a lot of it is sort of an estimation, but we know that she was somewhere within this range. She was definitely 2-masted, possibly 3-masted. She was made of oak, beech, and ash. And she used up 2,735 oak trees, 1,100 beech trees, and 170 ash trees. That's how much wood went into the planking and building and framing of this ship. And I said that she was a triple clinker. Oh, before I get there, this is not the Grace Dieu. This is the HMS Victory. This is how big she was. She was around the same size as the Victory. And the Victory is huge. So this is the cross section of the triple skin clinker planking. Instead of having one plank, you would sandwich caulking between 3 planks, and then you would drive an iron spike into the frame to hold it together, and then you would use oak trunnels to hold all those together. So this is why she took so much wood. For every 1 plank, there was on a normal ship, she had 3. They probably did this for rigidity and hopefully to help with the caulking and to make it stronger in case of an attack. Her anchor was the largest piece of iron in England for her time. It had a 17-foot 2-inch shaft. It had an almost 11.5-foot span of the arms on the anchor. It was a massive anchor for a massive ship. And of course she had more than 1 anchor too, but this was the largest one she had. So, the thing about the Grace Dieu is she never saw combat. By the time that she was launched in 1418, England had control of the channel. There was almost no piracy going on in the English Channel during this time period because Henry had taken it over. He had clear and direct pathways to bring people over from England to France unopposed. There was a mutiny on her maiden voyage. It began at the dock. The shipmaster, when the crew arrived for muster, and the clerk in charge of taking muster started to take names, the ship's master, the captain, basically took it out of his hands, ripped it off, and threw it overboard. He wanted no person's name associated with this ship. We don't know why there was a mutiny. They finally got on board, they got underway, but as they got out around the Isle of Wight, basically the crew said, "We're done, we're not doing this anymore. Drop us off at the Isle of Wight. Figure out how to get home yourself." We don't know why. One of the prevailing theories is they were scared. Nothing this big had ever been built or sailed before. And he was crewing it with the same number of men that he was putting on the smaller ships. So she had a crew of about 200 sailors. You know, the Trinity Royale had a crew of about 200 sailors on her. And it was, only 540 tons. This is 2,500 tons. So it was probably really hard to sail, and they didn't like it. There are also concerns about how well she was put together, because, again, nobody had done anything like this before. So whatever happened, though, they gave up. And she was brought back, moved to a reserve port at Southampton in 1420, stayed there waiting in case that she was needed, moved to a mud berth in the River Hamble in 1434. After this, they start selling off parts of her. They sold off a portion of her mast. They sold off plankings. They sold off iron fittings. They did this to all of the ships to pay for extreme debts of Henry VI. And then she was struck by lightning and burned to the waterline in 1439. But how, so this was just something I did up for fun. This is a very rough size comparison. So that's our Virginia out there, and these are the other ships that would have been around her. So she definitely would have been a tender ship for either the Jesus or for Grace. So I am not a boat person by nature. Growing up, I didn't do boats, even though I grew up on the coast. So I hear people look at Virginia and they're like, oh, she's small. And I'm like, what do you mean she's small? She's like 50 feet long. I said, oh, she's huge. I love that big boat. And then I'm like, oh. She is small, yes. So that's just a brief size comparison. So how do we know what became of them? How do we know these are all up on the River Hamble? 1, written records. 2, so this is where they were. They were up on the River Hamble above Burselden, sort of in that little turn of the river there. There's a community park there. There's a local float that you can go out to get to. And we know they're docked there because of records. If anything, Henry V demanded accountability in his accounting. He wanted to know where everything was. He was fastidious in being an administrator. But 2, archaeological finds. So in as early as 1933, they actually found the Graysdale. They thought it might have been her. They didn't know. And doing some archaeological digs on her, they fairly confirmed that that's exactly what it was. You can see the remnants of her hull sticking out from the mud when the tide is low. It's the only time you can see her. And then in 2015, they identified the Holy Ghost upriver from her a little bit. So met very much sort of the same fate. Didn't get struck by lightning and burnt to the ground, but pieced off piece by piece by piece over the years. They think the Jesus and the Trinity Royale are also in there somewhere. They don't know. When it comes to the Jesus, though, whatever's going to be left there is actually going to be much smaller, because that was broken down and reconstructed into a Ballinger called the Little Jesus. So it was used for a number of years afterwards. But they do think that there are still pieces of it somewhere in the river, and they don't know about the Trinity Royale, what happened to that one. So, and then in 1422, Henry did the worst thing he could possibly do. He died. Henry V died, leaving behind a very young son and mountains of debt. England was just drowning in debt because of the 100 Years' War at this time. He could barely pay for the troops. The Navy became an afterthought. Basically, it became well, they're already there. Why do we need a Navy? And once they started dismantling the Navy, you're going to see things start to go south. So in 1429, Henry had a lot more of France by this time. And they start losing it. By 1429, they've lost some. By 1431, they've lost even more. They're getting really close to Paris. And then within 30 years, all England has left is Calais. That's it, which they held on to for about another 100 years after that. So Henry, when it comes to the 100 Years' War, especially the final stages of it, it's pretty generally agreed that he was keeping it going by force of will alone. And once he died, everything just fell apart because nobody had the will to keep it going or the money. But it's a lot easier. He was sort of the type of man and king where he would say, I need you to loan me money. And you're like, okay. When his brother would come to you and say, I need you to loan me money. I don't want to loan you money. You're not Henry. Get out of here. So, and even his son, who was being taken care of by a regency council at this time, things started to go south fast. And then soon after this, England has a whole new bunch of troubles because the War of the Roses starts off. Basically, the 100 Years' War comes home, and they start fighting amongst themselves. And it stays this way. The Navy sort of languishes throughout the War of the Roses until Henry VIII comes in 1546. He founds the Royal Navy, starts putting a lot of money into it, and says, we need to have this. Because Henry basically wanted to be his own. He wanted to call his own shots on everything. He didn't want to be beholden to anybody. He wanted to be able to take over the world if he wanted to. So, and we all know how well that went for him, though. He did, however, have a couple of great ships. Oh, where'd that slide go? Yeah. A couple of great ships himself. He took a page from Henry V and built his own Grace Deo, the Henry Grace Deo, Henry's Grace of God, and the Mary Rose, which it's actually sort of fitting that isn't working because it is just a picture of the shipwreck. So it's a wreck altogether, I guess. The Mary Rose, of course, is probably the more famous because they actually found it. It sank in, outside of Portsmouth with a crew on board, and has become one of the great, maritime archaeological finds for that era ever found. Neither of these ships were as large as the Grace Deo. They were smaller. The Mary Rose was only about 3/4 of the size. So even though they were starting to put more masts on them and do more guns and things like that, they were still smaller ships. And that brings us to the end. So thank you so much for coming tonight. I hope you forgive me for the typos that were in my hastily put together slides.